To your point, I would love to talk about the role of women in this show, because I think one of the things that I was struck by was the fact that like Desdemona is this disembodied voice the whole show. She never gets to speak. She doesn't get a word. She doesn't get to say anything. She's just like this sounds, the like voice sounds, and then she's murdered. And also the fact like the decision on the part of like the Q brothers to kind of make the other women in the story clowns was a very interesting choice to me, especially like being so familiar with the story. I'm curious how y'all handled that with your audiences and like what your response to those things were.
Someone a long time ago, like after the show finished, came up to me and brought up that point, like, why wasn't there an actual Desdemona? Why didn't someone just play her? And I think what we did was really special, was to prove a point that using a pillow to represent Desdemona in our show is to lean towards how women are objectified. Like they don't have a voice in some cases. They don't have the ability to like contest their case. Like you can tell them, you can say your truth, but it's like you're not heard. And so being able to convey that by having Desdemona silent and only being able to make noises is what I feel sometimes in past experiences, like I have been silenced, my voice has been nothing but noise, and I haven't been heard. And that's how I view that.
Dope. Does anybody else want to say anything on that?
You know, I think a lot of, I think things that we took away from it too, and you know, from Megan, from a directing standpoint, the show existed in the way it was, and these are all things that we noticed straight out of the gate through our first read through. And so there was a lot of thought put in and kind of conversations and bouncing ideas about what these things mean, and specifically from Megan and what these things mean to her. There's really no way to know the intention of the writers and why Desdemona's voice isn't there and why Emilia and Bianca are played the way they are. And due to like the text and the way that they work in the songs, there's really no other way to play the Emilia and Bianca characters, because, you know, the jokes are written in. And so, yeah, I think what Karina said is something I agree with wholeheartedly, but I think it's also, you know, we're placing our own kind of feelings on it to make it okay with us. And, you know, I think that's where it's like, okay, this is our interpretation of the text in a way that, you know, we're giving it this sort of thought, but I'm not sure exactly what the thought was and the intention was of the writers. But through that adaptation, of course, is kind of what allowed us to make it in that way, I believe. My personal issue, though, with it was I saw Othello at the Globe with Andre Holland and Mark Rylance that summer. It was super dope. And it was like, all of a sudden, like things clicked. I saw it, and the Emilia character was like the best character in the show. Like, she's so amazing, you know? And I was like, whoa, like this, Othello's like about Emilia. It's like a vehicle for her, really, like to me. And so I did a lot more research afterwards about Othello, because really I didn't know loads about the show. And I kind of think that they did a lot of disservice to the characters of Emilia, specifically Bianca. And I think that Desdemona is a weak character, like is written really weak. Like she doesn't have much agency through Othello. And I think that's one thing in the remix that could have still worked. Like if Desdemona was played the same way she's played, I think that's kind of interesting. But if Emilia was stronger and was given words a bit more serious with more gravity, I think it could have been hammered home really hard, even if it was another dude playing it for the sake of the scope of the show, like it was written and intended, you know. But there's really no way Mark could get around that, for instance, or if any of us had that role, that we could get around it, because that's just the way the words were.
Yeah, I mean, I think that based on the original text, Emilia should definitely be viewed through the lens of like a domestic violence survivor because of her relationship with Iago. And I think it's unfortunate that we characterize her in such a specific way. But I think that, I don't know if any of you know Whitney White, but Whitney White has a series of shows that she's been working on, musical adaptations of Shakespeare. through the lens of like different music. And one of the ones she has is All Is But a Fantasy, and it is specifically through the lens of Emilia, and it's her story. It's a set up like a concert, and I think that's really interesting. And I also think one of the other like some of the other companion pieces that I really have responded to about the women in the world of the show and the women that we don't get to meet are like I can't remember the name. Oh, I think it's called Desdemona. But I've read the Toni Morrison one, which was like a concert adaptation about Desdemona and Othello meeting again in the afterlife. And Barbara, who was like Desdemona's maid, turns out to be like Othello's mother. And those conversations about women and the roles that they play, and how like maybe Desdemona never saw him because he was Black, which I think is brilliant. And also Harlem Duets by Djanet Sears is a really brilliant like companion piece to Othello, which I think is really interesting, and it talks about the woman that Othello divorced to marry Desdemona, which is really interesting. Does anybody else want to say something before I ask another question? Josh, you want to go?
I think one of the tragic aspects of Othello is that nobody listens to Desdemona. Nobody listens to Desdemona. If Othello would have sat down and had a real conversation with Desdemona and believed her and listened to her, you know, the whole tragedy could have been stopped. But nobody hears her. And the fact that these writers, you know, regressed her just to some aria, I think really just hits on that point that, you know what I mean, that they had dull ears. They never listened to Desdemona, you know? Yeah. And I think where the story kind of makes a parody of the sexism that's blatant throughout Shakespeare, and kind of comments on it, I think it misses, like Julian was saying, the power of Emilia and that monologue that she has, that's like one of the great Shakespearean monologues, and that the fact that you kind of lowbrow it and kind of dumb it down and disregard it, Emilia, to this doting, you know, kind of silly character. I think you kind of you miss the power of the text. And I know me and Julian talked about, like, some of it is just it's written really silly, you know, and almost for like, but I know for people, and one of the things that we got from the show was that people who didn't like hip hop, they really liked this show. And people who didn't like Shakespeare or had a bad interpretation of Shakespeare, a bad experience with Shakespeare, you know, they liked it. So I think kind of dumbing it down and kind of making it silly makes it more palatable for people who like have this preconception or rejection towards Shakespeare, but at the same time, you know what I mean, like a great female character like Emilia, you know, the fact that you can dumb it down like that is kind of, I don't know, you miss the power.
Right. It makes the work more accessible, but it keeps us from moving the conversation forward.
Right.
And honestly, I actually really enjoyed playing Emilia. I actually enjoyed playing her more than Cassio in a lot of ways, just because I really felt like she was the moral center of the story. And just like with Desdemona, Emilia, it's almost, I don't want to compare, but Emilia actually had a voice, but yet nobody listened. Over and over again, whether it was Iago, whether it was Othello, nobody ever listened to her. And all she wanted to do was stick up for Desdemona, and she wanted to, and she was silenced pretty much the whole time. But one of the things that I really loved about playing Emilia was that last scene, the crazy scene, which took us so long in rehearsal to get that down. But, you know, Megan and I had a talk at some point when we were doing rehearsals, and I don't know if it came up this way in the recording, but we saw some YouTube video of the Q brothers doing the show too. And I know that last scene, there's sort of some leeway as far as how Emilia can be played. And Megan and I talked about this, and I was with it 100%, where I wanted to make her really emotional and make that last scene really sort of like powerful, and not do it in a humorous sort of campy way that Emilia kind of did a lot of the other scenes. I really kind of wanted to go for it in that, to kind of bring that notion home that, like, hey, listen, this is like really important. You guys need to listen to me, and that don't laugh at me, like listen to me. And so it was really powerful for me to be able to do that, because it was my first, I've never played a female character before. It was only my fourth actual like real play that I've done. And we did the whole thing in like 2 weeks
Yeah,
rehearsal, maybe. I mean, it was, so I'd never worked on that kind of a schedule before. And it took us maybe up until a couple days before we opened, where we were like, all right, I think we got it. I think we can roll with this. And it was that last scene that was for me was the trickiest, but it was the most important scene of all. And I felt like I really needed to give it justice. And so I enjoyed it. And I feel like, I feel like she, along with everyone else, needed to have more of a voice than they did. And it was very indicative and reflective of the time then, and in a lot of ways, the time now.
Yeah.
And just to piggyback off of that too, I think, what you're saying, Mark, is totally true, and you killed it completely, you know what I mean? And it was but it was that point that Megan was talking about where the show went super dramatic in that second half, post the death of Desdemona. And then now it's time for Emilia to kind of reveal the fact that if everybody listened to her, it'd be good. But then all of a sudden the jokes are back. Every line, I don't know, I'm yelling at Emilia, and then they're like, oh, you're standing behind an invisible door, and these little things. And it's almost again, the opportunity to go super dramatic, I think would have only enhanced exactly what you were talking about. But it was we're almost there, then we pull it back with a joke. Almost there, pull it back with a joke, or we're talking about the death of Desdemona, and Josh is like, oh, I swore she was dead at the end of the last song, or oh, Roderigo was the guy who fixed my video games, And not saying that's anything against the writers, because the intention was to lighten the mood, because they got really, really dramatic right before that. But maybe it's just my personality. I would have loved to have swung into something where we really kind of pull an okie doke on the audience.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to praise Megan McQueen too, because Othello's character doesn't play a woman, unlike the other characters throughout the role, until it's a man's world. And I remember her direction and really hitting home in the fact she's we're not playing caricatures of women. You know what I mean? You are playing strong women with the intent of being sick and tired of male BS. You know what I mean? So she wasn't we're not being caricatures of women. It's no, you're gonna embrace your femininity, and you're gonna own this. This part of the show. So I really appreciate that sense of direction that she had.
Yeah.
One of the biggest parts that can obviously come off a little bit offensive, but I think that the way we handled it, how delicate it was when we did Man's World, and how it's way over the top, it's ridiculous, yeah, but at the same time it was like how Josh said, it was the point where the women are all right, we're kind of sick and tired of this, that nobody's really listening to us, and it's the only time that you actually really hear how the women feel and what they're really thinking about, and it was crazy, because that's one of the most ridiculous parts in the whole show, and the three of us are up there, shirts tied up, chains, hanging off. It looked, it could come off super goofy, but I think that like how Josh said, embracing the femininity that we had, and just going all out with it, and trying to relate with not having your voice heard, as far as being somebody of another sex, another person of color. It relates to all that stuff, and I think that was one of the best parts in the whole show, is when you finally get to hear what all the women have to say about all these dudes that think that they have it all figured out. I think that was one of the coolest parts.
Got you. Heard.
What was really interesting for me when I interviewed Megan and Julian and Josh was I hadn't seen the show yet. The way that you were inhabiting these characters, and then also inhabiting these female characters. And then Megan said on the air that you were in tears when you were rehearsing that the first time, because of how powerful it was to be, for all of it to be coming out then with women, actors of color, white, Shakespeare, rap, and hip hop. It just really, I just have never forgotten hearing all the three of you talk about that too, because that just felt like, isn't that what theater is all the time? You're inhabiting another character, and the assumptions, which this whole afternoon conversation has been about, the assumptions that we make about who can inhabit what, and who's allowed to inhabit any place, right? Is just really what you're getting at.
Leora, really quickly, when you mentioned crying in the room, I just want to explain to people that what happened is when we were rehearsing that piece, I came in with a bunch of facts about women being murdered by their husbands and women of color being murdered and rates at which people are murdered and how, and just all of this information. And so here we were, right, with all the guys like doing all this sexy whatever that people are going to laugh at. But our conversation was not about that. And part of the failings of the writing, as Amara and Julian especially have pointed out, is like, and Josh as well, is that that isn't seen, like that work wasn't seen. It can't be seen in the way that we presented it, but it was so powerful in the room to have these three, you know, masculine dudes, like masculine dudes like working that out. We keep saying three because Mark was not wearing the same like sexy stuff, but believe me, he would have rocked that outfit too.
Mark was sexy.
That was what was beautiful about that, was that they were interpreting, they were really giving that their attention.
I kind of agree and disagree with not being able to know, Megan, that you had done that kind of work or rehearsal work, because I could detect it. I think that what I found really great about this piece at the time that it was originally presented and in this particular community was that it offered so many ins for people at so many levels. And I think a lot of you have spoken to the fact that it's based on Shakespeare. So there are a lot of people who already have that kind of context. For some people, it was the hip hop, and the fact that for some people that meant they had their in, they could enjoy it. I think for a lot of folks, it meant that it was a great piece of entertainment that was unlike any other piece of theater that is normally offered in our area. They went home and they were satisfied. And for a lot of us, it was something that became such conversation fodder for a long time. And so I thought that that was probably the beauty of this particular piece. I know for me personally, I think it's interesting that part of the early conversation this afternoon was about Shakespeare and how there's always a conversation about the problems of Shakespeare. And when we continue to do it, especially a piece like Othello specifically, where race and misogyny, et cetera, is such a sticking point for whenever anybody produces it. I also think the opposite with this piece. I thought about hip hop and how even though the vehicle was hip hop, there are for some people things about hip hop that need to be examined. And I thought that that was something for me when I saw the moments where the gentlemen were portraying women and how early on it was comic, that it made me think, and I had conversations with Megan and other people about, you know, that's interesting that this vehicle of hip hop, where there have been grapplings with homophobia and transphobia and et cetera, like how that was, you know, acceptable, or, you know, where that lands in the conversation. And I do say that later on in the piece, especially with Woman's World, Man's World, it was like, it shifted and it made me realize, okay, there were conversations that were had. It wasn't just glossed over. I know it was a short rehearsal period, but I could totally detect that this wasn't just blatantly, let's get this over with, let's be superficial and comic for the sake of being comic. I could detect all of that in there. So thank you.
Thank you.
First, let me say the show was great. I didn't get to see it in person. I was no doubt gigging and really busy, because I think that was a time where I was really working a lot. But I got to say that whole scene it just came out perfectly. Like everything you guys are talking about, like it came to me through the screen as I was watching it digitally. So Man's World scene was brilliantly done. And I got to say, you know, there is a little bit of sex appeal that comes out there, you know what I'm saying? So that's good.